Hi, good day, everyone. Dr. Scott Stoll, co-founder of Plantrician Project. And today I'm here with one of my really good friends, Dr. Cyrus Khambatta. He's the co-founder of Mastering Diabetes, New York Times bestselling author, and I believe one of the experts in the area of diabetes, whole food plant-based diet, and a lifestyle. And Cyrus and I have this in common. We both absolutely love mangoes, and we're mango addicts. So Cyrus, thanks for joining me. It's great to have you today. Thanks for taking a few minutes.
Absolutely, Dr. Stoll. Thanks for inviting me here. I'm
Yeah.
always in the presence of, I love being in the presence of people who love mangoes as well. So this will be fun.
That's right. It's not mango season here, but I'm looking forward to those fresh mangoes, and they do come back into season.
For sure, for
So
sure.
Cyrus, as you know, World Diabetes Day is coming up on November 14th. And, as you just read through the website, they talk a lot about awareness, about education, about prevention, but nowhere on the website do they talk about remission or reversal. And I know that you all at Mastering Diabetes have mastered this concept of optimizing type 1 diabetes, but also helping to reverse and send diabetes into remission for people living with type 2 diabetes. So today I want to dive into both of those topics and even get down into a little bit of the biochemistry, because you and I both love that, the mechanisms of insulin resistance. So we'll take a deep dive there too. But in the next 10, 15 minutes, I just really want to give people an understanding of how powerful food is, and that the World Diabetes Day should be talking about whole food plant-based diet and lifestyle as the primary intervention and management for type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So maybe let's just start with type 1, because I know that you live with this as well. And you personally have just seen incredible changes, but through Mastering Diabetes, you all have worked with some people that have had incredible transformations. So maybe just highlight a couple of those stories of people that have reduced their insulin from huge doses to really, physiologic doses that they require to manage their diabetes, just to kind of give people a feel for what's possible.
For sure, for sure. Yeah. So in the world of type 1 diabetes, as you know, the predominant rhetoric or the predominant narrative is that the best way to control your blood glucose is using a low carbohydrate diet, whether it's an Atkins diet or a paleo diet or just a general low carbohydrate diet or a keto diet. The focus is always on carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are bad for you. Carbohydrates will make you need more insulin. Carbohydrates will send your glucose extremely high, and carbohydrates are going to increase your cholesterol. So that's what people in the world of diabetes, and especially type 1 diabetes, are constantly being told over and over and over again. And unfortunately, that information is true, but only under specific situations. Okay. So the key to really understanding how you can use a whole food plant-based diet, a low fat plant-based whole food diet, the way that we recommend, to your advantage, whether you're living with an autoimmune version of diabetes or whether you're living with prediabetes or type 2, is really to focus on understanding that your dietary fat intake is also another huge variable which influences your ability to control your blood glucose. Okay. So again, people are always saying it's all about carbs, all about carbs. And the answer is it's not all about carbohydrates. It never has been, and it never will be. The diet that you consume is a complex makeup of carbohydrate, fat, protein, vitamins, minerals, fiber, water, antioxidants, and phytochemicals, and boiling a very complex collection of macro and micronutrients down to just one and saying it's all about carbohydrates is just biologically inaccurate. So it turns out that when you consume a diet that's actually low in fat, that actually increases your ability to absorb glucose in your liver and muscle. And that's a good thing. So that means that when you lower your fat intake and hopefully transition towards more plant-based foods like we recommend, that by lowering your fat intake, you can actually increase your carbohydrate tolerance. That means you can eat more carbohydrate-rich food from whole sources. And that energy, the glucose from those carbohydrates, can get inside of your liver and muscles without causing your blood glucose to go high. And that's a good thing. So when I was first diagnosed with type 1 diabetes back in 2002, I had made the transition from a low carbohydrate diet to a low fat plant-based whole food diet. And within 24 hours, I kid you not, 24 hours, my blood glucose started to fall, and it started to fall quickly. I was using 42 units of insulin per day and I was eating about 100 grams of carbohydrate per day. And within a short period of time, within a week of the transition, I went from eating 100 grams of carbohydrate to 600 grams of carbohydrate per day, which is more than your average person with type 1 diabetes will eat in a week or maybe even a month, right? So I was eating 600 grams of carbohydrate per day, which is a 6-fold increase in my carbohydrate intake, but yet my insulin use went from 42 units down all the way down to 25 units. So I was eating 6 times as much carbohydrate for 40% less insulin. And at that point I was like, oh my God, this is fascinating, because clearly there's something that's just more, there's more information here. And this ability to control blood glucose boils down to more than just carbohydrate intake. End of story. So there's other people that are living with type 1 diabetes that we have coached over the course of time, literally thousands of people, which is fantastic. And some of these stories a couple of stories of people with type 1 in particular that pop to mind are Chris. Okay. So Chris is he's in his 70s. He's been living with type 1 diabetes for 59 years when he first joined the Mastering Diabetes program.
Wow.
Not only had he been living with type 1 diabetes for 59 years, but he had become severely overweight. He was bordering on obesity. He developed rheumatoid arthritis. He had a lot of stiffness and pain inside of his hands and his feet. Okay. He was hypertensive. His cholesterol was high, and his blood glucose was very difficult to control. So he came to us and he said, hey guys, I want to see if I can improve my eating habits and maybe that'll have an effect on just diabetes. And we said, sure, let's try it out. So he transitioned to a whole food plant-based diet. He felt way more energy than he had felt in a long time within the first month. And then it got better, and then it got better. And he noticed his insulin use was starting to come down. His blood glucose was starting to come down. His blood pressure was coming down. His blood cholesterol was coming down. Fast forward 8 months. 8 months into the process, Chris had lost 70 pounds off of his body. 70 pounds were gone, off of hypertensive medication, off of a statin medication, because his blood pressure was normal, his cholesterol was normal. He cut his use of insulin, both basal and bolus, by 50%. And he had way more energy than he knew what to do with. The best part about this whole story is that Chris had completely reversed rheumatoid arthritis. And when I say reversed rheumatoid arthritis, you can use whatever terminology you want. He was asymptomatic or he was in remission. Maybe he still had it, but he had 0 symptoms of it. So as a result of that, he also got off of his rheumatoid arthritis medication as well. So he went from having 11 total medications down to 2, basal and bolus insulin, because he had type 1 diabetes and he would continue to need that for the rest of his life. So he was just a complete advocate and is a true testament to just how powerful this approach can be, because not only is it reducing his insulin need, it's also getting him off of a bunch of other pharmaceutical medications, which quite frankly were only necessary because he was living in an insulin resistant, overweight, hypertensive, and high cholesterol body.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a powerful story. And as you and I know, the benefits of this whole food plant-based lifestyle, it's not just that we're managing blood sugars or type 1 diabetes, but the collateral benefits are incredible in Chris's life. I mean, he recaptured so much quality of life by simply changing what he put on his plate. And I know that you've done that for thousands of other people, and changed their lives. Why hasn't medicine embraced this idea if it's so powerful?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, you know better than anyone that the world of nutrition is highly debated, right? So there's a lot of controversy in the world of nutrition. You have sort of, a collection of randomized control trials that say oftentimes they come to two polar opposite conclusions. You have randomized control trials and meta-analysis that basically say in the world of diabetes that eating a low carbohydrate diet is the solution. It's the most effective form of blood glucose reduction. It's the most effective way to reduce A1C and control diabetes. And then on the other hand, you have randomized control trials that are saying, no, actually eating a plant-based diet or reducing your fat intake is actually more beneficial. And here's the molecular mechanism to describe it, right? So because of that, it can be challenging for a medical institution, or, the entire sort of diabetes world to be able to say, okay, great, let's change the philosophy from a low carbohydrate diet to maybe a low fat and or plant-based and or whole food diet. I wish it could happen faster, because the biochemistry is extremely strong. I mean, the molecular mechanism of insulin resistance or of dietary fat suppressing glucose uptake, that biochemistry is spelled out in exquisite detail. It is very straightforward, and it has been demonstrated over and over and over again in preclinical trials with animals, in human clinical trials, and as far as I'm concerned, there's a sufficient amount of evidence at this point that demonstrates just the true power of a low-fat plant-based whole food diet. But again, medicine moves relatively slowly, and I wish that this information could somehow change policy, but the diabetes machinery has become so big over the course of time that changing an entire institution might unfortunately just take a little bit longer than you or I want.
So let's take that minute now, and because you mentioned the biochemistry, and let's just kind of like glide over some of that biochemistry that you talked about, because it is so interesting and so exciting. And I think it just really, gives so much validity to the idea that the food is actually transforming your body at a cellular level. So maybe you can just kind of take us in over the top and glide us over some of that biochemistry to help all of us understand that a little more clearly.
For sure, for sure. Okay, so I'll try and keep it simple and entertaining at the same time. Okay. So
You do a great job.
thank you. Okay, so when you consume dietary fat from food, the fat either comes from animal sources or it comes from plant sources. Okay, the fat is locked up as a triglyceride molecule. That's the predominant form that it's found in food. The triglyceride molecules exist either in red meat, white meat, fish, chicken, dairy products, and eggs from the animal world, or the triglyceride molecules are found in avocados, nuts, seeds, olives, coconuts, and vegetable oils. Okay, so those are the sort of like fat-rich counterparts from both sides of the equation. Regardless of which type of food you consume, the triglyceride molecule, we're going to sort of trace what happens as soon as it goes inside of your mouth. Okay, so you consume fat-rich foods either from plants or from animals, and those triglyceride molecules, they go in your mouth, they travel down your esophagus, they get into your stomach. At that point, they're acted on by a bunch of gastric enzymes, and then they're passed into your small intestine. In your small intestine, it's effectively a bioreactor, and the small intestine has a collection of digestive enzymes that continue to act on the food. And those digestive enzymes are manufactured by your small intestine. They're also manufactured by your liver. They're also manufactured by your pancreas. And these are enzymes whose responsibility it is to act on the carbohydrate, the fat, the protein, the vitamins, the minerals, the fiber, water, antioxidants, and break the food apart and make the chyme more digestible so that those individual nutrients can then be transported across the small intestine wall and put into the blood. So the triglyceride in particular is acted upon by a bunch of lipases made by your pancreas and made by the small intestine. And these lipases free the fatty acids. So there's 3 fatty acids attached to one glycerol molecule that makes triglyceride. So these lipases break the bond between the glycerol and the fatty acids. And now you have free-floating fatty acids that are then absorbed across the wall of the small intestine, and they're transported into your lymph, and they're eventually put into chylomicron particles. So these chylomicron particles, they circulate all throughout your body. And these are particles that basically absorb, they're the little spaceships that take the fatty acids from the food that you consume, and their responsibility is to donate or to give those fatty acids to tissues that require it. So this is where the story actually gets quite interesting, because the primary target of these chylomicrons is to give fatty acids to your adipose tissue. Your adipose tissue being your fat tissue, which is located everywhere, right? You got it in your neck, in your armpits, in your chest, in your abdomen, in your butt. So if 100% of all the fatty acids from these chylomicron particles were directed to your adipose tissue, chances are in today's world, diabetes wouldn't really be that big of a problem. And the reason is because your adipose tissue is actually a very safe place to store fatty acids. It's both mechanically and enzymatically designed to uptake fatty acids from the blood and to hold on to those fatty acids for extended periods of time. And then when the time is right, those fatty acids are liberated from the adipose tissue and they're sent to other tissues like your liver and muscle to be burned for energy. So if the chylomicrons deliver these fatty acids only to your adipose tissue, then diabetes would be, it would be a small problem, but it wouldn't really be an epidemic. The problem is that these chylomicrons, they deliver the fatty acids to your adipose tissue. But in addition to that, they also deliver fatty acids to your liver and to your muscle. Now, your liver and muscle are specifically designed to be able to uptake small amounts of fatty acids from your blood at any given moment in time. And the reason for that is because if you look inside the actual cellular architecture, what you'll find is that these cells are predominantly glucose dependent. And what that means is that they respond very well to glucose and insulin from the outside world. And they have a small ability to store lipid inside of a lipid particle or a lipid droplet. But they also have a much larger ability to be able to store glycogen and store glycogen as the storage form of glucose. In other words, they are designed to operate off of glucose and store glucose and burn glucose for energy. And they have an ability to uptake and burn fatty acids and store fatty acids, but only in small quantities. So when you consume a high-fat diet, like let's say you're eating a ketogenic diet, the ketogenic diet basically calls for high-fat foods for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day for weeks to months to years on end. So when you're consuming high-fat foods for breakfast and lunch, for dinner today, and then tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, within a short period of time, the fatty acid droplet or the lipid droplet inside of the liver and muscle begins to grow and begins to over-accumulate fatty acids. And when the over-accumulation of fatty acids occurs both in your liver and muscle, the insulin signaling pathway becomes less effective. And the reason for that is actually pretty straightforward. What the cell is responding to is the cell is basically saying, hold on a second, there's too much energy coming in here. These fatty acids, they're only supposed to be here in small quantities, but when they get overloaded and when they're forced to over-accumulate these fatty acids, they're actually responding to an energy overload, okay? And so by having an energy overload, what they're trying to do is basically block more energy from coming into the tissue. The easiest way to block energy from coming into any tissue is to just block the action of insulin, because insulin is the most powerful anabolic hormone in the human body. Okay, insulin promotes more fuel uptake and more storage than any other hormone in the human body, period, end of story. So if you are a cell inside of a liver and you're trying to block more fatty acids, more amino acids, and more glucose from coming in, the simplest thing you can do is make it so that insulin cannot communicate with you. And when you do that, you force macronutrients and amino acids and fatty acids and glucose to stay in the blood. So that's what they do, is they put on a self-defense mechanism and they shut down or they drastically reduce insulin signaling. And by doing that, the next time you consume a banana or a bowl of quinoa or some black beans, even if it's a whole carbohydrate-rich food, the glucose from that food tries to get inside of your liver, tries to get inside of your muscle. But because your liver and muscle have initiated this self-defense mechanism known as insulin resistance, both of them are now resistant to communicating with insulin, therefore resistant to absorbing glucose. So the presence of excess fatty acids has actually caused what I refer to as a metabolic traffic jam. And it's created metabolic traffic jam inside of the liver and muscle such that the next time you consume carbohydrate-rich food, the glucose gets trapped in your blood, the insulin gets trapped in your blood, causing both hyperinsulinemia and hyperglycemia at the same time, which is classic insulin resistance. So this is why over the course of time, when you consume a high-fat diet, people end up with a higher A1C value, a higher fasting blood glucose, a higher post-meal blood glucose, and higher insulin levels and higher glucose levels at the same time, because both glucose and insulin becomes less effective, glucose becomes trapped, and as a result of that, now you're sort of veering down the metabolic distress pathway, leading to the development of prediabetes and eventually type 2 diabetes. Is this making sense?
Yes, fantastic explanation. And it really begins to unpack too why a whole food plant-based diet is so effective for someone with type 1, because they can also develop insulin resistance over time, and especially type 2, because you're unpacking that traffic jam that you talked about. So maybe for the
Exactly right.
person with type 2 diabetes, you can just take a couple of minutes and describe how a whole food plant-based diet begins to rectify that problem.
Exactly right. So you hit it on the head, which is that people with type 1 diabetes are also susceptible to the same metabolic traffic jam that people with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes are as well, because the entire process starts at a high-fat diet and then leads to the development of insulin resistance. So in people living with type 2 diabetes, there's a spectrum, right? You start out with non-diabetic, and then you develop insulin resistance, and then you develop prediabetes, and then you develop type 2 diabetes. And it turns out that even if you went from non-diabetic all the way to type 2 diabetes, it is possible in the majority of all cases, something like 80%, 90% of all cases, to move from type 2 diabetes back to prediabetes, back to insulin resistant, back to non-diabetic. And we see this all the time. And unfortunately, the diabetes world is, this is a highly sort of like contested and highly sort of like debated effect of a low-fat plant-based whole food diet, but it is real. So the reason that it works, to answer your question, is very straightforward. We said earlier that when you overconsume fat in your diet, especially triglyceride, that the overconsumption of those fatty acid molecules blocks insulin signaling inside of your muscle and liver. So when you reduce your triglyceride intake by consuming low-fat plant-based whole foods, by reducing or eliminating dietary oils, by reducing or eliminating dairy products, by reducing or eliminating meat, by reducing or eliminating fish, what ends up happening is that the total supply of fatty acids in your diet or triglyceride in your diet goes down. So instead of being on the average, let's call it 80 grams of fatty acids per day, 80 grams of fat per day, if you can make that something like 30 grams of fat per day, 25 grams of fat per day, simply by doing that, what happens is that the lipid droplet inside of your liver and inside of your muscle, inside of billions of cells in both tissues, that lipid droplet now can be oxidized for ATP, and it can become oxidized much more rapidly. So what used to be a large lipid droplet, because it was getting a constant supply of fatty acids from the blood, now begins to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And I'm not insinuating that we want this lipid droplet to disappear altogether. It's not even possible. The goal is to get the lipid droplet to be the right physiological size inside of the cellular architecture. And when that happens, then this self-defense mechanism that your liver and muscle, that billions of cells have initiated, starts to go away. And now there's no reason for your liver and for your muscle to start blocking insulin anymore, because they're not trying to block excess fatty acids from accumulating. So as soon as you reduce the supply by doing this, now insulin action starts to go up. And because insulin action starts to go up, the next time you eat carbohydrate-rich foods, whether they're, again, quinoa, raisins, mangoes, bananas, whole grain bread, anytime you eat carbohydrate-rich foods, all of a sudden the glucose is now being shuttled to your liver and muscle. Insulin knocks on the door, says, hey, knock, knock, there's glucose in the blood. Do you want to take it up? And both tissues say, sure, of course, because I can now respond to you, insulin. Thank you for the signal. And then glucose starts to pour into both of those tissues, thus lowering the glucose value inside of your blood and getting rid of this metabolic traffic jam altogether.
That's fantastic. And for people that have type 2 diabetes, or clinicians working with patients that are living with type 2 diabetes and even type 1, how quickly does this happen? How quickly does the cellular physiology begin to do a 180-degree shift and blood sugars begin to lower?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I first made this transition myself, like I was saying earlier, I saw the transition within 24 hours. But I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm an anomaly, and maybe it's going to take a lot longer for other people. And it turns out that over the course of time, we've coached thousands of people into this process, and we've seen both in people with type 1 diabetes and in people who have either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, that the process is way faster than I ever thought was possible. So we're talking about years and years and years of fatty acid overaccumulation, years of metabolic distress, years of inflammation, years of weight gain, years of insulin resistance. And you can start to see improvements in your blood glucose values. and a reduction in insulin needs for those with insulin-dependent diabetes within days. So am I saying that you can reverse insulin resistance within days? Absolutely not. The insulin resistance takes a while to reverse. It could take 3 months, it could take 6 months, it could take a year. But you start to see the signs. You start to see improved glucose values and reduced need for insulin. And for a lot of people who take oral medications to treat diabetes, you see a reduced need for those within weeks. So if you follow a low-fat, truly low-fat, plant-based whole food diet, and you are very diligent about it, and you initiate this process within the span of a week, without question, you're going to see a dramatic improvement in your blood glucose values. Within 2 weeks, the first month or so, there's going to be no question in your mind as to whether or not it's working, because it becomes very obvious very quick.
And that is such good news for people that have struggled for so long, that it
No doubt.
happens so quickly.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap up here, one question I always like to ask, because there's so much research out there, and there's a lot of research that documents the benefits of whole food plant-based diet in diabetes, but what studies still need to be done to further prove this to the greater medical body, our colleagues? What do you think, what do we need to look at, or what studies would be really important in helping to establish broader guideline changes?
That's a great question. I sort of daydreamed about a particular, study. It's an investigation or collection of studies that I think would be very influential in the world of diabetes. And what I would like to see is, unfortunately, in the world of diabetes, there's a lot of short-term data. Okay, so you can put people on a ketogenic diet, and you can see dramatic improvements in their blood glucose and insulin use within the first 10 weeks. You can do the same thing with a plant-based diet. You'll see a dramatic improvement within the first 10 weeks. And a lot of the data shows 10-week results, 3-month results, maybe 6-month results. And that's good. I'm glad to see that. And seeing a reduction in blood glucose and A1C and insulin use is good. But ultimately, the short-term results have to equal or continue to promote an improvement in glucose and insulin over the course of time. And if they don't, then you have a problem. Okay, so what I would like to see is a direct head-to-head comparison of a low carbohydrate diet, like a ketogenic diet, which is 30 grams of net carbohydrate per day, versus a low-fat plant-based whole food diet, which calls for effectively less than 30 grams of total fat per day from exclusively plant foods. And if we could do a head-to-head comparison of these two diets in a decently large number of people, call it 500 to 1,000 people, and we do this over the course of multiple years with strict protocols in place to be able to track a number of changes. We want to track, how does A1C change? How does blood glucose change? How do cholesterol values change? How does blood pressure change? How does body weight change? But also another very important metric is dietary adherence. Because one thing that you see in the low carbohydrate world is that sometimes it's very challenging to adhere to a ketogenic diet or to adhere to a low carbohydrate diet, because the food cravings become really challenging and people lose a lot of energy and it just becomes very challenging. So I would like to see this direct head-to-head comparison and determine whether or not eating a ketogenic diet is more or less adherent than eating a low-fat plant-based whole food diet. I tend to think, obviously I'm biased, but I tend to think that eating a whole food plant-based diet is much easier to adhere to than eating a ketogenic diet. And I tend to think that the long-term data is going to skew in the direction of the plant-based diet, because that's going to promote more metabolic change, and that metabolic change is going to continue to persist over the course of time, versus the low carbohydrate methodology, which will give you quick results, but not necessarily sustain those results over the course of time.
Yeah, that's great. That would be an awesome study. That would be fantastic.
Let's do
Maybe
it.
we'll publish it in the International Journal of Disease Reversal and Prevention,
I
right?
would love to. I mean, honestly, if there are inroads to being able to make this type of study possible, like I really would like to do this. So let's talk about that at some point for sure.
Money and do it. That's right.
Yeah.
So just in closing, Cyrus, is there is there something that you, after all of your experience coaching so many people and seeing so much success consistently over the course of a number of years now. Is there something that you could just package as a short statement to our colleagues that would just give them maybe a nudge to go down this road and start looking at the evidence, encouragement to keep going on? Just something from your heart to our colleagues out there, because this is such a powerful message and such an important message that needs to be adopted by the medical community.
Absolutely. If you sort of take a step back from all the science and try and use a little bit of sort of like a bigger view, moving towards a plant-based diet solves so many problems simultaneously. It's better for the environment, it's better for animal welfare, it's better for human health. And I can make those three statements confidently because I've done a significant amount of research to determine that, all three of these, aspects are dramatically improved when people transition to a plant-based diet. I know there's a lot of conflict out there. I know it can be very challenging to try and weed through the evidence and try and understand, is this guy right? Is that guy right? Is this book right? Is that book right? I don't really understand. But trust me when I say that the power of a plant-based diet is unbelievable. The power of a plant-based diet is something that I have never encountered at any point in my scientific career. There's nothing that I've found that is more powerful than transitioning to a plant-based diet. We see this in the data, both from short-term and from long-term experiments. And we see it time and time and time again from so many anecdotal stories of people that have not only gone through our coaching program, but people who have been taught by Dr. Scott Stoll, people who have learned through other prominent authors as well. So transitioning to a more plant-based approach is something that is very doable. It's very worthwhile. And if you are personally a little bit skeptical about whether or not you think it might work for yourself or for your patients, what I would recommend doing is try it yourself. Try it yourself first and see the power inside of your own body and feel it inside of your own body. Check your energy levels, your body weight, check important biomarkers, and really get into it and feel what it feels like. And once you do, I think you will be very pleasantly surprised. And then you can go and serve others as a leader, knowing that you have a personal experience and an ability to read and understand data at the same time.
Awesome. Thank you, Cyrus. And if people want to find out more about your work with Mastering Diabetes and your book, where can they find you?
For sure. Thank you. So this is the book, Mastering Diabetes, right here. This came out in February. You can find this on Amazon. You can find it anywhere books are sold. You can also visit masteringdiabetes.org. And there we have a bunch of information. We have evidence-based blog, we have coaching program, and beyond. So anything that we can do to help out, we're here to help. And thank you so much for taking the time today, Dr. Stoll. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for joining me, Cyrus. This has been fantastic. And I think it's a really nice encapsulated dose of good plant-based medicine today. And it was really educational. So sincerely appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us, and wish you and your wife all the best. Thanks.
Thank you.
And everyone watching, thanks for joining us today. If you need more information, plantricianproject.org, and the journal that we mentioned, the International Journal of Disease Reversal and Prevention, IJDRP.org. It's a free journal, open source for anyone that's interested in learning more about the science of plant-based nutrition. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.